While I've been a listener to Porcupine Tree for many years, I've never really delved deeply into your solo material, and I was surprised at just how prolific you have been. There was quite a few albums there, so I've been cramming as much as I can to get a better idea of you as a solo musician before conducting this interview. But to help out other listeners such as myself that are newer to your solo material, what would you consider to be some of your quintessential tracks to listen to get a good idea and understanding of who Steven Wilson is as a solo performer?
So that's really hard to answer, and the reason it's really hard to answer is because I always say it depends on the agenda of the person that's asking the question. One of the things, if I can expand on that, one of the things I've been able to do in my solo career, particularly my solo career, which is much harder in the context of a band, is every album is different. Every album is very different. Every album is kind of using a different musical vocabulary. So in my solo career, I've been able to make electronic pop records, I've been able to make old school progressive rock records, I've been able to make, post-punk records, and that's the beauty of being a solo artist, is being able to move in different directions at will. And that's not something you can do in the context of a band, because in a band you all have to agree. It's very hard to get 4 or 5 people to agree, that you all want to go off in a tangent.
Yes.
So that was really why I went into my solo career in the first place, because for me personally, it's very important to be able to reinvent myself on a regular basis. That's hard in the context of a band for the reasons we've already talked about. So I'm kind of avoiding your question slightly because it's a very hard. If I knew that the person asking me was into old school progressive rock, I'd say go and listen to The Raven That Refused to Sing. If I thought the person asking me was more into modern contemporary pop, I would say go and listen to The Future Bites. If I thought the person asking me the question was more into this idea of the album as almost analogous with cinema, like a cinematic kind of experience, I'd say absolutely listen to the new record, the Harmony Codex.
Well, they should be listening to that one anyway, right?
They should be listening to that one anyway, because it's the new record, so that's what we're here to talk about. But I think there's something particularly magical about this new record, because it kind of draws in a lot of the elements from across my career into one record. So there are ambient pieces, there are progressive elements, there are elements of electronic music, there are elements of ambient music, there are elements of, kind of melancholic acoustic driven music, and they're all in this one record. So in many ways, this is as good a starting point as any to tell someone what Steven Wilson is about, because almost every aspect of my musical personas over the years is represented in some way on the Harmony Codex.
Yeah, so it's like an amalgamation of sort of all these different styles and influences that you've played with, all in one centralized space.
And some new ones too. It's an album that's trying to exist outside of any notion of genre. And I find at my age, and I've been doing this for 30 years now, more than 30 years, I find that's the number one thing for me, is try to create music which sounds like nothing but yourself.
Awesome.
And for me, that means incorporating a lot of different approaches I've had over the years.
Yeah, wicked. So on the Harmony Codex, obviously that is one of the albums that I've been poring over for the last couple of days. In particular, while discovering that one, I came across a few of the video clips that you've made to accompany it, especially the ones for Economy of Scale and What Life Brings. The cinematography, the lighting, and the choreography of the performers within those videos was stunning. Is there anything you can share with us about the conceptualization and the process of making those music videos? Because they were sick.
So one of the things I've kind of established, certainly throughout my solo career, is a very strong association with video, with great video makers, with people that have, in a way, kind of similar ambitions to me musically. They have those kind of same ambitions when it comes to creating visuals. And I've always loved that association of music and visuals. I mean, I grew up pretty much loving cinema just as much as I love music, and the two for me were always kind of associated. And this combination of music and video for me, or music and visuals for me, is potentially, when you get it right, it's the most powerful of all.
Yeah.
And so the two videos you've mentioned are actually both directed by the same guy, who's a new collaborator for me. I've never worked with Charlie before. And Charlie I came across because I was very interested in working with movement and with dance.
Yeah.
Not in the sort of, Saturday Night Fever sense of dance, but more in the sense of interpretation, in sort of, kind of interpretive movement.
Yes.
And so both of these videos use essentially dancers. And that's a new thing for me. And, I've always loved dance videos. I mean, I've loved dance and dance videos and never worked with dancers before. This is the first time really for me.
Yeah.
There's something about the music for me that just suggested this time around. And I'm very lucky to have found this director, Charlie, and to work with his choreographers on creating these very impressionistic dance-based videos.
Yes.
I'm very, very pleased with the way they've come out.
So, especially with the economy of scale, how it's all just that one-shot technique and just the little micro movements that are synchronized with your music. It's like little finger movements and things like that. Yeah, that was really awesome to see. As well as doing research with your music, I read a few other interviews that you've had with other publications. So I can maybe come up with some different things to ask you than perhaps you've had before. But then a couple of things I read in other interviews really intrigued me, especially your love for spatial audio mixing. And I was wondering if you wouldn't mind sharing with me a little bit perhaps of your process when it comes to thinking of music spatially, and if there's any sort of production technique secrets, if you will, that you used in the Harmony Codex or in other albums that you've worked with that you're happy to share with us.
So my interest in spatial audio goes back about 15 years now, when I started working in surround sound, which was at the time was 5.1. So you had the two speakers in front of you, but you also had two speakers behind you, and you had a centre speaker. And that presented a lot of possibilities to create something much more immersive for a listening experience. And what's really developed over the last 5 years particularly is Dolby Atmos and true spatial audio, which is as much about the way you create much about the way you use the vertical plane as well as the horizontal plane. And let me explain what I mean by that. So in Dolby Atmos, in true spatial audio, you have speakers also above the listener.
Yeah, firing up and overhead,
Exactly. So this is a game changer, because before that, spatial audio was always about how you distributed the sound in the horizontal plane. So you could put the music behind the listener, you could put the music in front of the listener, but now you can actually have the sound also above the listener. This to me is mind-blowing and incredible. And so with the Harmony Codex, I wanted to try and raise the bar in terms of what's achievable with that kind of sonic spectrum, if you like, that immersive situation. So I worked really hard. It's, to me, it's like you're sitting in the middle of, well, you're not only sitting in the middle of the music, you're kind of sitting in the middle of a movie, a piece of cinema for years. You've got...
Which plays right into your hands.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So with an album like the Harmony Codex, there's a lot of what you would call sound design elements going on. So it's not just, a traditional live band configuration. There's a lot of layers, there's a lot of sound design, little moments that happen in the music that only come in like once, some little sound design element or something. Sound effects. A lot of these things, they sound good in stereo, don't get me wrong, they still hopefully sound good in stereo, but they lend themselves perfectly to spatial audio, because you can create a whole sound field around the listener. So literally the music is coming from behind them, beside them, from above them. And for me, what I do lends itself perfectly to that kind of context for listening.
Yeah.
So it's hard to explain. This is one of the reasons why I've done a lot of playback events around this album. Mm-hmm. It's hard to explain. The best way to show people how that works is to get them to hear it that way.
Yeah, experience it for yourself.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I could talk about it all day long, mm-hmm. but there's no real substitute for actually hearing it that way.
Yeah. I don't have a Spatial set up myself, but I do have access to one, and I'll get access to that today. So I'm very interested to listen back to the record again in that Spatial mixing as well, and what you've done with it. So on another element with that, another thing that you've mentioned is wanting to also bring that to your live experiences by incorporating spatial audio elements during your live performances. Have you been able to make any moves towards that? And especially if so, any plans to bring it back to Australia?
So I'm just beginning to think about that now. My priority with this album, having come out of lockdown and the whole isolation thing, my priority with this album was to reconnect with the fan base, reconnect with people that listen to my music, and just make sure the album came out. And these listening events, I've been doing signings this last couple of weeks. I've been going around doing a lot of interviews, doing the traditional promotion. Mm-hmm. So I kind of put the live aspect a little bit to one side to mm-hmm. allow me to do that. Just beginning now to turn my attention to, I am going to present the album live. I think it would be a shame not to, obviously.
Yeah.
And yes, all I can tell you is that spatial audio is going to be a big part of the equation.
Awesome.
In terms of coming to Australia, absolutely. I'm very interested in creating, rather than doing the traditional kind of touring thing where mm-hmm. you set up a show every night in a different city on a different stage, mm-hmm. I'm a little bit more interested in perhaps doing slightly smaller venues, but doing a few nights in each venue, so that I can create more of a kind of environment that people will come into. And that's not just about the audio, that's also mm-hmm. about the visuals.
Yeah.
So these are all ideas that are kind of flying around my head at the moment, and we'll have to see exactly what. My manager will tell me I can't afford to do this, I can't afford to do that, so I have to have all these arguments and discussions with my management,
Yeah, weigh it up and see what side it lands on. But no, that'd be awesome. That is something I personally would love to come and experience myself, so hopefully that comes through.
I hope so too, yeah.
Back to the record itself, and again, I guess your career as a whole, you have had a lot of contributions with collaborators, contemporaries that you've worked with. There's, I understand, a whole remix side to the new record as well, which I haven't had a chance to listen to yet, but it sounds like you've worked with a few artists there that I'd love to hear their interpretations of what you've done. But that aside, is there any artists that you haven't had a chance to work with yet that you really would like to work on a project together with?
Oh, the list is endless. I mean, the list is endless. If we started talking about the artists that I would love to collaborate with, we'd be here all night.
One from each record behind you?
Yeah, probably. And a few more too, There's even more records which you can't see to the side.
I believe you.
So I think what's beautiful about being a solo artist is being able to, one of the things they say about solo artists is that the artist is always the same, mm-hmm. but they change people around them,
Yeah.
So that was the thing about people like Bowie. Bowie was always kind of the same, mm-hmm. but he was very good at changing the people he worked with, the different producers, different musicians, different mm-hmm. approaches. And that's what I love about being a solo artist, is being able to, keep it fresh in a way mm-hmm. by keep collaborations different.
Yeah.
So on this album, I've worked with a lot of different musicians I've not worked with, and I've had people like, Tears for Fears, Manic Street Preachers, Bob White, I've done a mix.
Wow.
And this is just a joy, to be able to collaborate with a lot of people whose music I admire. But, mm-hmm. You asked the question, who else? It's an endless list.
A very loaded question. All right. I've got one more for you if you've got time, Stephen.
Sure,
And that is, outside of your own personal realm, what's currently exciting you in your music? Are there any new artists that you've been discovering or listening to recently that you've been really enjoying?
Well, it's an interesting question because I still listen to a lot of new music. I mean, I've been doing this for more than 30 years now, so it would be very easy to become a bit complacent about my musical world and just do my own thing and kind of ignore what's going on. But I don't. I'm still very curious about what's going on in music, and music continues to change and continues to evolve, and not always necessarily in ways I like. I think that's the caveat here, is that I listen to a lot of stuff that I don't necessarily like, but I like some of the ideas, if that makes sense.
No, very much so.
I like some of the approaches to production. So my kids, for example, they love Billie Eilish.
Okay, yep.
It's not something I would listen to, but actually the production is incredible.
Yes.
Absolutely incredible. And I get, I listen to a lot of Billie Eilish. I get ideas from just the way she and her brother kind of approach making music, and their whole kind of musical vocabulary is completely different to mine. But that's very inspirational.
Yes.
And so, I do listen to modern pop music without necessarily always connecting on a deep emotional level, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but you're still identifying little elements and things that, like, maybe I could use that.
Yeah, and I like the fact that they're pushing things forward.
Yeah.
It doesn't sound like yet another variation of the Beatles' Blueprint, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And so much music for so long was essentially all descended from the Beatles, and now we have a new generation where it's almost like they haven't even heard that stuff, and I think that's refreshing in a way, because that's driving music forward, and I think music has to keep evolving. But in terms of stuff that still connects with me on a deeper emotional level, I guess it's still stuff that I find from the past. I'm old, so I start listening to jazz music. I listen to jazz now, and quite experimental jazz music. And also, I still discover music from the past that for whatever reason had kind of passed me by. For decades sometimes.
Yeah, that's kind of one of the beauties of the prevalence of streaming. I know there's downsides to being an artist and trying to make money out of it, but artists that you may have listened to for many, many years, but you've only probably had maybe one or two of their albums. Just so discovering your solo career. Here's an avenue, here's one album to check out, and then you're like, oh wow, look at all this other stuff I can now check out that back in the day, you would have had to have gone down to the good old record store and popped your dollars over to have that extensive music collection. Again, I don't see you having that much of a problem on that aspect, but still, the fact remains.
But you're exactly right. I think that's the thing, and also, it's also worth noting that a lot of really great music doesn't necessarily reach the mainstream, not because it's not good, but because it's just the timing is wrong. And so, for example, recently I've been going back and I read a book about the Bee Gees. I grew up in a house where my mum used to listen to the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack all the time.
Yeah, they grew up just down the road from here.
Right, of course, yeah, that's right. They did, yeah. And I think the beautiful thing about the Bee Gees is there's this whole back catalogue of stuff. They started in 1965 in Australia, I think, or something like that.
I'll fact check you later.
They made all these records long before they became the disco kings. And they went through all these different genres: psychedelic music, orchestral pop, baroque, soft rock. And I read this book about them, and it sent me down this rabbit hole of just discovering all of these albums I didn't even know about.
Yeah.
And none of them were particularly successful at the time because the timing was wrong.
Yeah.
They weren't. For whatever reason, they weren't making those records at a time when people... And I think that's fascinating sometimes to discover those records that have perhaps been unfairly, marginalised or overlooked. Not because they're not good, but just because they didn't resonate with the time, with the zeitgeist at the time.
Yeah, and now if somebody asks you what Bee Gees songs you'd recommend, you'd have to have more context, right? You'd have to know, are they a prog listener? Are they a psychedelic listener?
Absolutely, yeah, and that's a beautiful thing about that band is that they did do all of those things. You know, there's an album from 1969 called Odessa. I don't know if you know it. It's a double album. The Bee Gees back in 1969, which is completely prog.
Yeah,
it's this it's double concept album. It's completely progressive rock. And who'd have thought that the artists who made, you know, Staying Alive and Saturday Night Fever, but that, you know, that's, you know, this brings us right back to the beginning of our conversation. You know, this is why I wanted to do
bringing it around.
Solo career. Yeah, I love the idea of creating all these different, you know, corners to the catalogue.
Yeah,
and that's why it's so hard to answer your first question.
Yeah, exactly.
What would I recommend to somebody? Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Well, thank you so much for your time and hanging out with me today and answering my questions. Hopefully we hear news sometime soon that you'll be revisiting our shows. Otherwise, I'll be revisiting your album a lot.
Thank you very much. Nice to speak to you, Rash.
Yeah, likewise, dude. Take care, bud.
Bye now.
See ya.
Bye.